Welcome to the YOUnify podcast. If you're new here, YOUnify is a global nonprofit organization. We are dedicated to helping you flourish and thrive. My name is Brandyn Keating, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of YOUnify and the host of this podcast. One of the things that we're trying to do on this podcast is help lift up things that you might not otherwise be seeing in your news feed and share some practical, actionable opportunities for you to flourish and thrive in your day-to-day that anybody can implement. I'm super excited today to have Matt Lee on the podcast, who is joining us from Waco, Texas. Is that right, Matt?
Yes, that's right.
Amazing. And Matt is an expert in the area of flourishing and is one of the lead editors of this book, Leadership for Flourishing, that we're going to be talking a lot about on the podcast. There are so many good nuggets in there. And I'm super excited to dig in with you, Matt, not only about the book, but also about your own work in the area of flourishing and beyond. So let's jump in. The first thing is, Matt, that you are a man of many titles. So I am not going to try to list them all off. I know that you're a professor there at Baylor University. I know that you're a research affiliate with the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, which has its own robust description. So could you share with us some of your robust titles and maybe translate for us what you actually do in the day-to-day?
Well, thank you, Brandyn, for inviting me today and also for your important contribution to our book. This is a collective effort to promote leadership for flourishing as opposed to the management of scarcity, I guess we could say. And so, as you noted, I'm have been fortunate enough to have a lot of collaborators and a number of affiliations, including with the medical school at Stony Brook University and the business school at Fordham University. And also, I think they designated me as a community engaged scholar at the Experiential Learning Center at the University of Akron. So I sort of wear a lot of different hats, and I'm involved in a number of different research projects, but also increasingly getting to the practical application of what does it mean in a particular setting. So whether it's business or education or medicine, healthcare, the goal is the same. How do we move away from, I would say, understandings of partial well-being that in the long term are counterproductive for the human species and for the planet, and moving in the direction of the fullness of flourishing, which would be complete well-being across all levels and dimensions and domains. So, of course, that's impossible to attain at any point in time, but we can strive for it and we can bring more of those domains and those levels into focus so that the individual is flourishing, the individual is contributing to the community's flourishing, the community is contributing to the individual's flourishing, and all communities are contributing to the entire world's flourishing. So
I
that
love
would be
this.
an ideal.
Yeah.
And so all of this work across all of these different organizations with all of these different affiliations is aligned with that in some critical way.
I love the idea of moving away from this partial sense of well-being and getting into a more fully robust sense of vibrancy and flourishing. So this word flourishing is it's kind of a big word. We can easily read a lot of different meanings into it. If you were to just kind of take one or two sentences to define what is the essence of flourishing as you understand it and work on it and try to cultivate it, what would those one or two sentences be?
Well, thank you. And before I give you the sentences, I will just say that I have found it helpful to invite dialogue
Mm.
to allow everyone that I'm working with to share how they understand flourishing so that I can kind of see from their perspective what they think flourishing means, and then how does that connect with what I think it means. And so we start this dialogue afresh every time, because there's some baggage when we use a particular word to try to narrate something that is in many cases bigger than the word, or more mysterious than language would, might reveal. So I would say, in a very simple way, flourishing is the good life,
Yeah.
or complete well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would be well-being that we are able to attain, not at the expense of others,
Mm.
but in collaboration with others, as they have their own kind of particular understandings of what the domains of well-being that collectively would lead to flourishing might mean. Now, in the book Leadership for Flourishing, I have a co-authored chapter where we define flourishing in the title in a particular way. So we say flourishing is whole human well-being in beloved communities and thriving ecosystems. So that gives you a sense of some of the different levels that we're talking about. We don't think that it's possible for us to flourish alone. We might be resilient or have some partial experience of subjective well-being, but in order to flourish, we must love and share and care, and that happens in beloved community.
So much richness in there, Matt. Yeah. Yeah, no, so there's just so much in what you're sharing. I want to just try and unpack a couple pieces. One is, it sounds like fundamental to the definition of flourishing as you see it is that it's sort of a dynamic living definition that we can all participate in. And then number two is, it sounds like you're saying that this definition of flourishing that's sort of living and dynamic and an ongoing conversation also is sort of pushing away or moving away from this idea that we have to compete and push the other guy down for ourselves to rise up, but rather that if we cooperate and collaborate, that individually and at a community level, we can all flourish. So I'd love to hear from you if I've got those two things right, and maybe a little bit about then what is the definition of leadership for flourishing, if those pieces are correct.
That's wonderful. And one of the chapters, I love all the chapters in the book, but one of the chapters that I had more direct involvement with is by Kath Bishop, who was an Olympic silver medalist. And her chapter is about, because you mentioned competition. Well, it's fine to compete, but not where competition becomes the highest value, or winning becomes the highest value. So her chapter's on redefining winning. And so we want to attain excellence. We want excellent performance, for example. But so many athletes at all levels, including at the highest levels, um, have had such a destructive experience, a
Mm.
dehumanizing experience
Mm.
through competition. And some of them say things like, I'd give this medal back if
Oh,
I didn't
wow.
have to go through what I experienced to get this medal. So looking beyond the status symbols to
Mm.
the question of how are we becoming better people together, and how are we then able to promote the flourishing of everyone who's part of this system, even if it's a competitive system. So, some of my friends in Spain have said, well, the word flourishing doesn't translate very well. Why don't
Interesting.
you say fulfillment in plenitude? And I said, well, that's interesting language in English. It's kind of unusual. I think, all of these definitions are just starting points
Yeah.
for us to have a genuine dialogue, where the goal is not only to impose what we love on the
Mm.
world, but to understand what other people love, and figure out how, as a species, we can begin to integrate and maybe even harmonize these different ways of being and doing. And one of the things I like about your chapter, Brandyn, in advancing the work of the global flourishing goals, is that that is really a framework for dialogue. There's a kind of anchor. There's certain essentials that whatever else we think flourishing might be, if we don't have those essentials, we're probably missing something important. But there's room for people to work with those essentials and groups also, and to propose other things or to share other things. But how would it relate back to some of the essentials, like finding a greater sense of meaning and purpose, or
Absolutely.
becoming a better person, or having healthier relationships? So those kind of essential ingredients give us a basis for offering an invitation, and then the dialogue can actually be quite wide ranging and even surprising as we deal with this thing that is somewhat elusive and transcendent, but is something we ought to keep our eyes on at least part of the time. And I argue that all human endeavors ought to be in service of flourishing in some way. And that seems like a pretty bold claim, but if we're getting in the way of flourishing, then the question is that worthwhile? And this is one of the things. I could go to the leadership definition in a second, but this is one of the things we say about the difference between extractive processes,
Mm-hmm.
transactional processes, and flourishing processes. And ultimately, leadership at its best is going to move us in the direction of creating flourishing systems and flourishing processes that benefit everyone rather than just a few. So if it's
Fantastic.
extractive, then we're pursuing selfish forms of well-being in ways that harm other people. We could call that violence.
Mm,
We think it's well-being, but actually that's violent because
mm.
we're externalizing the harms, or we're taking or stealing in order to get our well-being. Transaction is a little bit better, but still pretty dehumanizing. It may be efficient
Yeah.
with regard to some particular goal, some narrow goal, but if in the end people feel dehumanized or objectified in some way, then it's just leaving them languishing or perhaps even suffering. And so when we move to flourishing, this is, what does it look like when we're all fully alive
Mm.
together through our collaborations, through the way that we invite each other to show up and how we hold the space together? And then what's the noble purpose that we're serving? How is it benefiting others outside of our particular collaboration? And so leadership is going to be about that.
Mm.
And I would say, we have people who are influential. One way to think about leadership is that the leader is someone who's influential. Someone who
Who has power? Yeah.
invites others to see a vision and to get excited about that and to move in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And we can be moving in a good direction or a bad direction. So ultimately, leadership for flourishing is just good leadership. I can read a short couple of sentences from the book. We kicked this book off with a couple of sentences on this topic that might
Let's
give people kind of a more clear grasp of the vision that we have. But I'm happy to answer a question before I start reading.
Yeah, let's leave that as a cliffhanger for just a minute. We'll dive into those sentences in a second. There's so much richness in what you just shared, Matt. Absolutely incredible. And I love this idea that we can all be contributing to one another's well being and fulfillment and flourishing at the same time as we are elevating our own by sort of redefining what success looks like and what excellence looks like and what winning looks like. Really fantastic, and I think really timely as well. Before we dig deeper into leadership for flourishing and get to that excerpt from the chapter that you mentioned, I want to learn a little bit more about you and let our audience understand a little bit more about you. Like, how did you become this guy who is traveling all over the world with all of these deep, rich, actionable ideas about flourishing, how we can better lead, how we can better live, how we can evolve our entire society? Did you know you were going to be this guy doing all of these things affiliated with Harvard, writing books? Did you know you were gonna be this guy when you were growing up, a little boy in Ohio, right?
Yes, Ohio. And no, the answer is no. And I still don't quite understand it, to be honest with you. I was talking with a friend, Donna Hicks, who has written some wonderful books on like leading with dignity and others. And we were in Mexico doing an event, and I said she was kind of sharing some of her background, and I said, well, I never thought I would have any business, here in Mexico at a business school. I'm not trained as a business professor. I'm a sociologist. Actually, for most of my career, I was a criminologist. My first book is on criminal homicide. So there's really no way that I could have planned any of this to happen. And I was telling Donna, sometimes I'm not sure that I'm the right person. I didn't start with this in my background. I didn't take a lot of college courses, really any courses on this kind of topic. So, I'm not, I don't know. Maybe I'm the wrong person. And she said, well, for whatever reason, you have been selected. So why don't you just take responsibility for that?
Beautiful. I
And
love it.
and I've come to understand. Somebody gave me this, and I forget where it came from, but the idea of responsibility as being able to respond. Not that I will necessarily have the right answer or the perfect response or whatever, but that I'm able to respond. So I think because so many people in the community have invested in me, that I've been doing all of these apprenticeships with,
Mm-hmm.
Byron Johnson and Tyler Vanderweel and other people leading this great work around the world, that that I'm able to respond. And that's and the way I respond is generally to invite more dialogue, because I don't know that I have a full response, or that any one person can have a complete response. But I think together we can share what we're learning, and continue that apprenticeship. I was quoting in a talk a little while ago, an article by Otto Scharmer, who was quoting Ed Schein right at the end
A
of
chain of
Ed's life.
quotes, if
Ed
you
was a
will.
very
Yeah.
famous organizational systems thinker.
Mm-hmm.
You know, helped organizations transform
And
and
who's
become
Otto
simply
Scharmer
better.
for people who might not know? Who's Otto Scharmer?
Otto's Ed was at MIT. He's passed away. Otto's also at MIT. Otto's the founder of the Presencing Institute.
Mm-hmm.
So Otto had been on a Zoom with Ed right before he passed away, and he was still helping people to the end of his life. And then shortly
Yeah.
after the Zoom passed, and one of the last things Ed said to the group, was, I think this work comes down to learning to access the wisdom of our ignorance
Mm.
so that we might learn to access the wisdom of our love. So these things
Wow.
are accessible, and yet we can't just go out and proclaim based on our limited knowledge what flourishing is and how everyone ought to flourish. So again, coming back to your chapter on the global flourishing goals, what's a process by which we could share some things that seem to be universally desired by human beings around the world, and that any understanding of flourishing ought to grapple with them in some ways, but allow for some self-determination of individuals and
Mm-hmm.
groups within that process. So that's always a joyful journey. Whenever I've done that kind of approach with groups, it always works well. And that's where I say I'm able to respond by inviting that kind of conversation. So my inclination is to ask you how you define flourishing, and turn it into more of a dialogue. But it's your show, so you can direct me away from that line of engagement. But I would love to, because we've talked at length
Yeah.
about things. But how is this resonating with you, and what would you add to it or subtract from it to get closer to the essence?
Yeah. Oh, I love that invitation, Matt. And yeah, I mean, I think just a couple of things that you have mentioned that I want to lift up is one, the invitational nature, I think, of the work that you are doing on flourishing, and that, and thank you for the kind words about one of the two chapters there that I have in the book. I think the invitational nature of how we are approaching flourishing is actually essential to its definition. So I think that's the thing that I'll respond with, that we can shift how we lead businesses, how we lead government, how we lead our own family unit or our neighborhood block or a classroom or a sports team. We can shift that into a state of being better off if it's not somebody sits in a back room and makes up all the rules and what's right and then tries to push them on to other people in a hierarchy, but rather that how we determine what's right and how the group engages together and moves forward is determined in an ongoing conversation in that invitational way. So for me, one of the things that's actually essential to the definition which you have been describing and is essential to the usefulness of flourishing as a way to think about how we make change in the world that we live in, how we make it better, is this idea that at its essence, flourishing is invitational. It's an invitation, and that flourishing leadership is invitational. That it's dynamic, that it's facilitative, that it's not telling, it's inquiring. And I think everything you're sharing is totally consistent with that. And in that spirit of inquiry, I still want our audience to get to know more of the essence of Matt.
Okay.
So,
Well,
so
I'm always really reluctant to center myself. I
I know
guess
you are. That's
one
because
thing
you're a leader
one
for
thing
flourishing.
yeah. What's that?
I said that's because you're a leader for flourishing. What can you share with us? Can you share? You're always trying to center everybody else in the conversation, but can you share just something that might be surprising about you to people listening today, to people that know you really well? What's a habit, a hobby, an interest, just something fun that might surprise people about Matt Lee, or it could be
Yeah, I
something
get this. I
intense.
get this question a lot, and I guess the way I'll answer it today, it's. And by the way, I loved how you responded about flourishing as an invitation, and I think that's what makes it different than the pursuit of well-being, where a group can decide we're invited and nobody else is.
Mm,
But with flourishing, it's the metaphor of the garden. All
yes.
of the plants and trees within the garden are all playing a role. There's some mutuality going on there. So everyone's invited. And, that's why I like again, going back to Otto Scharmer and some of the work he and his colleagues have been doing, talking about leadership is not the person at the top of a hierarchy, because you mentioned hierarchy as well, that
Yes.
leadership is a capacity of a system. So
Mm-hmm.
everyone can be influential, everyone has something to offer, and everyone's invited. So one way that I think this worked out, maybe I had this intuition or just good luck or whatever happened there, but I was teaching a class called Sociology of Law,
Mm.
and I put into the syllabus one day devoted. The title was "Law: What's Love Got to Do with It?"
I love it.
Like the
Anytime we
Tina
can bring
Turner
Tina
song. And
Turner
of
in,
course, I was
yeah.
going to talk about like mediation processes, restorative
Yeah.
justice. Not retribution, not zero sum, not adversarial, but these more loving ways of being. If we think about extraction as dividing people or creating polarization or leaving people worse off, that's a movement of hate and violence. Hate is what divides. And
Yes.
then these other things are, more loving in the sense that they unify,
Mm-hmm.
to use your organization's name. Yeah.
To
And
coin a
so,
term, if
so
you
we
will.
think about leadership for flourishing as being about bringing people together in a joyful way. And so I
Mm-hmm.
had this one day in my syllabus, and the students liked it, and I
Mm-hmm.
liked it. And so the next semester, I made it a week. And
Oh,
again, it was like the highlight of the semester. Why aren't we
yeah.
doing more of this? So again, just kind of like being part of that dialogue, like what do human beings naturally want to do? You got to
Mm-hmm.
learn about some of the bad stuff, of course, not be, so that you can be realistic. but you want to have an appreciative inquiry in life as well. You want to find the things that are good and learn more about them. And so we turned it into 2 weeks, and then pretty soon it was just taking up larger and larger share of the course and some of my other courses. And once I had tenure, I said, I don't really want to teach some of these crime and law related classes anymore. I'd like to teach sociology of love. So sociology of
Interesting.
law sort of morphed into sociology of love, which was fun, but not too transformational. So
Mm-hmm.
why not call it love in action? And the world is the classroom, not sitting here talking about readings and taking exams. Of course, there was a grading process and there were assignments, but go
Yeah.
out and experiment and come back and let's have a dialogue and share the collective, individual and collective wisdom that emerges from that, generative dialogue where something unexpected comes up. And I often felt like I was a student in the class more so than an instructor. And then that class sort of turned into something I called the meaning of life, and
Really?
offered that through the honors college. So I would say that through dialogue, so that's not terribly surprising, like this
No,
journey.
I need something like, what was your first concert? What's some
Okay, yeah.
strange
So I was going to
talent
get
that
to
you
the
have?
surprising thing, and I'll tie it
Oh, okay. We're still
to
getting
this
there. All right.
journey. So
I was going to say, Matt, if that's a surprising thing, but you're
no, no,
tying it
no.
all
So
together.
so
Okay. Keep
that's the
weaving.
the
Yes.
emergence for me of
Yeah.
a clearer sense of purpose rather than just like do what you're assigned to do. Start to discover through dialogue and the wisdom of others,
Mm-hmm.
where you should be looking and where you should be moving. And so earlier in life, I was much less focused. I wouldn't say I'm terribly focused now either. I've got a bit more focus, but I so one thing that's surprising people don't know is that I jumped out of an airplane right after I graduated high school. And so
Really?
this was the kind of thing I would do because I didn't really have a sense of direction or whatever. So let's do
Mm-hmm.
thrill seeking kinds of things
Mm-hmm.
just to get that sense of transcendence or whatever, adrenaline rush, whatever
Mm-hmm.
we're looking for. So now what I would say is I've been on this journey and I've had so many friends in dialogue helping me along, first and foremost students, but of course mentors and others, family and friends, and just the list goes on,
Mm.
is that I know skydiving is not a terribly risky thing, but
Mm-hmm.
there's some risk
There is some
involved.
risk. I have
And a
not
lot
done
of
it.
the decisions I make now are I don't want to put myself at risk because I want to do this work,
Mm.
collaborative work that I'm doing with these other people to promote flourishing.
Mm.
So, when I was in residence at Harvard, I'm affiliated, but now living in Texas and working at Baylor full time. But when I was there working full time, I got to know some folks who were studying self injury mortality, and their
Self-injury
argument is
mortality.
we
Wait
don't
a minute, Matt. Will
know
you just say, like, just to make sure everybody knows, self-injury mortality, what does that mean?
self injury mortality. So it could be something like suicide, where the
Mm-hmm.
intention's very clear because you left a note saying what you're going to do.
Right.
But it could be other things like really reckless behavior that look like an
Mm-hmm.
accident, where
Mm.
you could have probably foreseen that there was a high level of risk there and
Yeah.
you decided not to. So it's kind of like, if we look at all the drug overdoses and suicides and cirrhosis of the liver and deaths of despair and all these things, and
Mm-hmm.
expand it out to understand reckless accidents and other things, it's one of the leading causes of death. And it's
Really?
basically the sense that my life is not worth preserving.
Wow.
I might as well roll the dice. And I kind of felt that way as a young person.
Really?
Not that I was in particular despair, but just thrill seeking or looking for transcendence. And
Mm-hmm.
so now, because of the kind of work I'm doing and because I have a family of my own and
Yeah.
responsibilities and things, I'm more interested in not thoughtlessly making the risky choice,
Yeah.
because I think there's something important, perhaps even sacred, in the
Mm-hmm.
work that we're doing, and I don't want to miss out on a day of that.
Amazing. What a journey. And I think, Matt, there are probably so many people who actually deeply relate to what you were sharing, to having that feeling that, you know, maybe their life doesn't hold a lot of value, or tomorrow doesn't feel like something to look so much forward to, especially with all of the sort of extremely disturbing things we are often seeing in our news and our news feeds, and with the loneliness epidemic that's happening, as coined by a previous Surgeon General, and the mental health crisis of our young people. I bet a lot of people can kind of relate to that. And I'm curious as to whether, you mentioned all of these apprenticeships, and I'm curious as to whether there was a little bit of maybe a turning point for you, or a something that took you from the guy who's jumping out of planes and feeling a little bit reckless about whether there's a tomorrow. I'm sure there were many steps along the path, but maybe early on, would you be able to identify like a first step, a first door that opened, or a first direction that opened up to you?
The answer is probably, if I could go back and give it some thought, I think there's a million opportunities and I kept missing and missing and missing. I think, here's a door and I'm walking right into the wall again. So, one of the things that I guess I would say was helpful along the way is that, I was at a university that wasn't doing very well financially, and a group of us started really leaning into experiential learning. There was a space created at the university for some experimentation. We started referring to the things that we were creating as unclasses, because they were the
Oh,
opposite of everything we were doing in our regular classes. Like, what would it look like if we co-created the syllabus with the students? What would it look like if we, instead of grading the students graded us? I mean, just like crazy ideas. And
love
some of
that.
them didn't work out very well. And, some of them worked out marvelously. But, just that sense that we have, that we can do something different, that whatever's happening right now, we don't have to be part of it, and we can do the opposite. And so I guess I've sort of been slow to wake up to that notion that we have more freedom than we thought, and there's consequences that go along with exercising our freedom.
Yeah.
But what I would invite is a conversation with someone who's struggling about, just remember, when did you feel most fully alive? Everyone's felt alive at one point or another in life. What were you doing? Who were you doing it with? How were you doing it? Okay, then how does that relate to your daily experience? And this is where some research on natural disasters is really interesting. I worked for 2 years over the summer in graduate school at the Disaster Research Institute at the University of Delaware when I was working on my
Fascinating.
PhD. And they always had grants, and hungry grad students need to eat in the summertime. And so
Yeah.
but it was great. But I listened to these recorded interviews, and I was supposed to transcribe these things. So you'd have to listen over and over again, because I'm a slow typist. So you rewind it, play it back, and try to type it accurately. And what a number of people were saying, which surprised me, was that they felt like during the disaster, when the power went out, or the earthquake happened, or the floods came, or the hurricane hit, whatever the thing was, they kind of felt more alive, because they had a sense of purpose. They knew that there was a goal. It was a shared goal. We have to survive.
Right. It
Right, it
really
really
clarifies the
clarifies the
goal,
goal,
right?
right?
We have to help each other. So I'm needed. I'm not a cog in the machine. And many of us feel like cogs in the machine, because we are. In a lot of our organizations, we don't matter. If we quit today, the organization would go on as if nothing happened. So in that moment, the natural disaster releases us from the social disaster of everyday life. And sometimes people don't want to go back. Like, I have solidarity, I have meaning, I have a sense that life is shared with a tribe, why would I want to go back to this anonymous, bureaucracy, which is my daily life? And so sometimes in disasters, neighbors who've never said two words to each other all of a sudden, by virtue of necessity, have to help each other, and they
Band
get to know each
together.
other very well, and they form these deep bonds. So nobody says let's create disasters so
No,
people can connect, but let's notice how the architecture of daily life is preventing us from
it's
having that
preventing. Yeah.
experience. So the way back in is to ask someone, when have you felt most fully alive?
Mm,
And the other question is, when do you see your love making a difference in the world? And if there's
beautiful.
not an immediate answer to that, think back to at some point, probably they will tell a story about how they've helped someone else.
Hmm.
And yeah, that felt good in that moment.
Yeah.
Well, what if it was more natural for us to be more compassionate and helpful in our everyday lives? What if we structured our worlds in ways to elicit that? I think, that would be very energizing for a lot of
Mm,
people. And so if loneliness and disconnection is a big problem right now, then that's because we have designed for that. That's
mm.
what the system gets. Every system's perfectly designed to get the outcome that it gets by definition.
Yes.
So what if we started doing unclasses? The students
Hmm.
came alive in those unclasses because they were the co-pilot. They weren't just stuck in the luggage rack.
Right. They weren't in
You
that
know, I said,
hierarchy.
I need
Yeah.
you to fly the plane right now, take
Yeah.
over. It's that kind of spirit of co-creation that I think is at the heart of leadership for flourishing, because everybody has something to contribute. And our systems often don't invite people to fully share how they would love to see their love make a difference in the world.
Great. So let's then come back to the Leadership for Flourishing book. And again, it's such an all star lineup of folks that have contributed chapters to this book. And let's dig back into that definition of leadership for flourishing that we started in on, and go to one of your chapters where I think you have a couple sentences that help us
Yeah,
understand
I'd
it.
love to read this. And,
Please.
so I wrote this. This is the very first page of the editor's introduction. You don't write the introduction until the book's basically done. So you've seen everything, and there's a lot of surprises and a lot of um, just ways of helping me think in a fresh way about flourishing. So a lot of what came out of this almost 500-page book really enriched my understanding of leadership for flourishing and helped me to write these lines.
Mm,
But I think that it's a summary of kind of where we're at the moment, and I don't know where we will be in a year or 10 years from now.
right.
So this is a snapshot in time for whatever it's worth. So I say leadership at its best is about nurturing the hero that wants to emerge and the future that wants to be born. In other words, it's a form of love in action, an expression of deep awareness, presence, and care that creates new and better worlds from the raw materials of the current context. Leadership is a skillful practice that simultaneously loves inspiring heroes and desirable futures more fully into being. Individuals play a critical role as leaders, but leadership is actually about the capacity of the system to empower all members to contribute their gifts in the service of a noble shared purpose. So this eliminates right away any kind of organized extraction where almost everybody in the planet is worse off and a few people benefit.
And
So
let's make sure
there's
that
a great cartoon that sometimes when I give talks I show this. It's a middle-aged man sitting in a cave with some children. They're all dressed in rags,
mm,
and the man saying to the younger generation, "Well, yeah, the planet got destroyed, but for a while we generated a lot of shareholder value." So that's not leadership for flourishing. That's kind of
no.
short-termism, not being responsible in the sense of being able to respond 7 generations
Yeah.
in the future. So leadership for flourishing is really about how do we cultivate these heroes that can help us co-create the future that actually wants to be born, a future grounded in love, where people are able to flourish and non-humans able to flourish as well. It's not, extracting from animals that, to feed, just to feed the human flourishing, but how do we regenerate the capacities that are life affirming and allow everyone to flourish? And that is a very, it's not something that is um, conventional. It's kind of countercultural right now,
Yes.
I would say. Most, um, people who occupy top roles in organizations would say, my job is to generate shareholder value, or my job is to achieve the narrow goals as set forth in the strategic plan of this organization. And if that has some benefits beyond that, that's great, but that's not my job. It's somebody else's job to be a steward of the system. My job is to manage what I see in front of me. And I use that word manage intentionally there, because we sometimes make a distinction between achieving the goals that have already been set with the resources we have, and we call that management, versus leadership, which is creating new resources to
Yes.
achieve a more noble set of goals, or a broader set of goals that more inclusively benefit all. And so I think that's a leadership challenge. And oftentimes we're focused on a way of managing what we have for the goals that have been given to us. And what the unclasses were trying to do is to suggest there's a different way to live, and we don't have to wait until some distant future. Let's just do it right now. And sometimes we got into trouble, and sometimes things didn't work. But you create these laboratories where you can make mistakes, and there's so little room in the education system for making mistakes. Everybody wants a perfect GPA and a perfect test score, and you don't want to fall behind in the competition. But life, you make a lot of mistakes. And
And
so
those
we need
mistakes are
an educational
usually,
journey that
yeah.
allows people to make those mistakes and learn from the mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the learning and the progress happens, right? Is in that making a mistake or having a failure and then figuring out how to get to the next level. So, Matt, if I am not a business leader or not a leader in an educational institution in the traditional definition, in the definition of somebody who has that sort of a title, but maybe I feel more like I'm one of those cogs in a wheel. Or maybe I haven't even found the wheel to be a cog in, right? Maybe I'm trying to find my way. But I think more people feel like they are inside of the system than feel like they are shaping the system. And you and I care a lot about and work a lot on systems change. And for people who wouldn't know where to begin on that, which, by the way, I was one of those people, absolutely. 20 years ago, I had no idea of where to begin on systems change. And for people who maybe that sounds so overwhelming, and I'm just trying to get through my day in the wheel that I'm a cog in, and maybe get to the next level, or maybe just get through the day. How can everybody, no matter where they're starting from, sort of move from this, or help us move from this extractive way that systems are working now to a more flourishing, a more regenerative way? And in like really simple terms, and maybe also if you could describe a little bit more deeply, what do we mean about the difference between extractive and regenerative, and how can we all play a part?
Yeah, that's wonderful questions. And, I know, like, the work you're doing with civic assemblies, trying to bring people together in a container where people can hold different viewpoints. There can be polarized viewpoints, but there's a process by which we begin to find a shared interest, a common interest that we want to work towards together. And so, part of it is structural.
Mm-hmm.
So what can the individual do when there's no civic assemblies or whatever? That's a separate thing. But we could be more intentional about our designs and
Mm-hmm.
invite people out of these echo chambers where they're just sniping at each other and there's no genuine learning or sharing or
Mm-hmm.
collaborating. And so create something like a civic assembly. So the structure is really important. But even if you're not in that structure right now, history is replete with examples of individuals who said, this thing that everyone else is doing is just not for me.
Yeah.
And so the question is, why do some people have that orientation? Why do they have an internal locus of control?
Mm-hmm.
Why do they have a mindset, so to speak? So, one of my friends, Gary, at the Entrepreneurial Mindset Initiative, and his latest book is the Entrepreneurial Mindset Advantage. He says that a lot of even business schools teach entrepreneurship with a managerial mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that we can do is change our mindset. And I went through one of Gary's workshops about 10 years ago, and it just crystallized for me that there were more opportunities and possibilities out there than I could see because I was looking through a scarcity managerial mindset.
The one we're
And
trained into, right?
if I started looking more entrepreneurially, then all kinds of new possibilities would open up. And it didn't mean starting a business. I was a professor, but I started thinking more entrepreneurially and then collaborating with people. And Gary would say the secret sauce for entrepreneurs is empathy.
Mm.
They see what's not working for people and they use their imaginations to conjure up an image of what a better world would be. And then they try to prototype and they make a bunch of mistakes. And then eventually something works and then people want to support it. They want to resource it somehow. So I think all of us can begin to recognize how our mindsets have limited us. And of course, there are terrible structural conditions where there are everything's against the odds and all of that. So that's why I started with it's helpful to have containers that invite co-creation instead of hierarchies that just annihilate people. So we start with the structures, but even within our, there's always the example of the person who just said, I'm not interested in living in this world. I'm going to create a different one. And you just find people who um, are energized by that. What would your world have that my world doesn't have? Well, it would have an opportunity for all of us to co-create. Oh, I want that world too. And it's
Yeah.
not like you have to push back against the empire. You just start creating something fresh and people join you and you create these islands of coherence in the sea of chaos. And sometimes they're stamped out. That's part of the human history as well. We've got these stories of things um, that were really beautiful and just crushed by the evil empire. But the point is to live fully alive, and and to do that and not recklessly, not to contribute to self-injury mortality, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
We try to do that with practical wisdom. And there's just no escape from the fundamentals. So we go back to the basic virtues, the idea of practical wisdom, and the idea that love is what brings it all together. And we just start inviting people to get curious about that and to take steps that are sane and rational instead of reckless and harmful. And so that starts to look like leadership for flourishing.
Amazing. And so, Matt, what is one thing that you are struggling with yourself personally when it comes to flourishing right now? And what's one thing that is helping you flourish in the current context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I've been struggling with for years now is, now that I have the entrepreneurial mindset, there's just an infinite array of opportunities,
Mm.
and I'm just involved in so many things. So there's only so many hours in the day, and I'm energized about the start of collaborations, and then I'm worn out when it comes time to work with the online system that won't accept the document in the format that I've tried to upload it. It's those kinds of things that I think there's and this so the thing that's helping me flourishing are the members of my community who tell me to stop
Mm.
doing that.
Yeah.
Hey, there's seasons in life, Matt. Why don't you recognize that it's not spring all the time and you're not going to have a million blossoms, but
Mm-hmm.
winter is the time to pull back to the roots. And so that's part of flourishing too. So I think I'm learning a little bit better about the rhythms of life in general and the rhythms of my life in particular. And it's been a community that's helped me. So when I read those sentences from the first pages of the book, of course, Jim and Katie, the co-editors, are in a chorus with me. Of course, some of that is quoted from Otto Scharmer. I was quoting from Lubra Trzynska, who was a nurse in a Nazi death camp and saved like 100 children. And people said, "You must have been very brave." And she said, "Well, I don't see myself as particularly brave, but I think within all of us, there's a hero that wants to be born." And
Mm.
she was helping others in that terrible situation behave more like a hero rather than a villain. And that was a work of leadership. And she would say
Absolutely.
it was collaborative. It wasn't just me.
Yeah.
And so, when I think about, anything that I might write, there's at least 100 uncredited co-authors in every sentence.
Yes.
So that's
Indeed.
my strength, is that I pay attention to community, and my weakness is I want to live in spring all the time, and the physical body wears out.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think we all struggle, in this sort of hustle culture, and maybe especially those of us, who maybe didn't think that we'd have some of the opportunities that we had when we were growing up. Didn't know that we could make change in the ways that we're able to, or collaborate with the people that we're able to now. And I would count myself in that camp. I think it's easy for us to stretch ourselves too thin, and community can be one of the things that helps us, not only with not stretching ourselves too thin, but just with any aspect of flourishing that we might think of. So I love that you brought those two things out. And on the note of community, one of the things that anybody can do, for anybody who's listening or watching right now, that you could do right now, that can help build community, that can help other people who are seeing all the negativity in their news feeds and online. One thing that you can do to help is actually download this podcast, subscribe, like, share. We are working through sharing this book with folks, Leadership for Flourishing, which I'll show here again, and through the work that we do in YOUnify to create a welcoming place for all people, where we can have that sense of community, and we can work together on making the world and just our day-to-day more flourishing, just our own community, our own space. But we are a new channel, and so we need the algorithms to respond to the liking and the sharing to get into people's feeds. So that is one thing that you can do to help, and we will put more opportunities and links to help, as well as a link to buy the book below. And Matt, would love to hear from you how people can be in touch or get involved, or where would you direct people who enjoyed what they heard from you and would like to learn more?
Well, thank you. And I think we've been hosting this Flourishing Network for 6.5 years now at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, and anyone's welcome to come to the monthly Zoom meetings. And we always have interesting speakers talking about some new facet of flourishing or their own
Mm-hmm.
work and how it relates to flourishing. And there's interest groups, including a wonderful Leadership for Flourishing interest group, that really a lot of the contributors to this volume are part of that interest group, or the Flourishing Network more generally. So, you can start your own community. You can plug into ours for a while and see if it's helpful. I wanted Brandyn to read one sentence from your chapter,
Oh,
which is a nice invitation to the entire world to get involved with the global flourishing goals movement, which
please
really
do. We
is
have 1 minute.
social movement. What's
Yeah.
that?
I said, please do. We have 1 minute.
One
So
minute. All right,
please
this is
do.
it. All right.
Okay.
The GFGs proposed a set of principles for 2050 for the global definition by every human of what better whole human well-being looks like from the perspective of every individual and group, family, community, organization, gathered into an aggregate that includes the ecosystem-wide flourishing of our whole planet. So that is something that everyone can get involved in right now. And, read your chapter, talk about it with friends and family and even people outside the near and dear. And let's start creating communities of practice for flourishing that in a way that invites as you say, defining what flourishing is through this process. So I'll read that first part again. It's a set of principles for the global definition by every human of what better whole human well-being looks like. So that's an open invitation, and there's existing structures to plug in. There's other structures that need to be created, and we all need to be entrepreneurially minded about that. I'm on LinkedIn as well. People can reach out there.
We'll
I'm
put
looking
that
at my
link below
inbox.
too.
I've got 3,400 unread messages. So email's not the best way, but through the network or through LinkedIn might be more effective.
Fair game. All right. Well, thank you so much, Matt, and thanks for bringing in the Global Flourishing Goals campaign. We'll put a link below as well as to how everybody can get involved in the Write the Future campaign, which is something you can do in your own community with your friends and neighbors to help get involved with that. And we look forward to seeing you soon in your favorite place, Matt, Utah.
Looking forward. Thanks, Brandyn. This was a wonderful dialogue.
You bet. And I think those are some pictures.